Imagine walking through the ancient streets of Kyoto, past temples that have stood for 1,000 years, past gardens where emperors once meditated. Now imagine turning left, away from the tourists, away from the beauty, into a neighborhood where something else has been quietly operating since 1924. 2.7 hectares of carefully planned invisibility. A facility that costs the equivalent of $20 million in today's money, built not to house criminals, but to erase them. The Kyoto detention house doesn't appear on tourist maps. Local residents have learned not to ask questions about the building that processes human beings with the efficiency of a postal sorting facility. For a century, rumors have leaked from behind those walls. Whispers of upside-down crucifixion towers. Stories so extreme they sound like medieval folklore. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The documented reality is worse than the mythology. Unheated cells where prisoners' breath freezes in winter air. Punishment positions held for 10 hours a day, for 60 days straight. Protection cells designed to break the human spirit through isolation, so complete it redefines what we think we know about systematic cruelty. All of it legal. All of it documented. All of it hidden behind regulations that aren't made public and procedures that aren't open to scrutiny. Today, we're opening the classified files on Japan's most secretive prison. We're following the money, reading the medical reports, and reconstructing the institutional machinery that transforms ordinary people into instruments of systematic torture. We're going inside the building that perfected the art of making people disappear without leaving fingerprints. This is the story they never wanted you to hear, told through the documents they never wanted you to see. If you're ready to confront the truth about what happens when a modern democracy decides that some people don't deserve to be treated like human beings, then stay with us. Because what we've uncovered will change how you think about justice, accountability, and the price of institutional secrecy in the 21st century. The temples of Kyoto draw millions. Their wooden frames hold centuries of prayer, their gardens mapped by pilgrims who walked the same stones their ancestors touched. But turn left from the tourist trail, past the souvenir stalls and tour buses, and you'll find yourself in Fushimi Ward, where a different kind of architecture waits in silence. 2.7 hectares. That's the footprint. Smaller than most shopping centers, larger than most secrets. The Kyoto detention house sits behind walls that don't advertise their purpose, in a neighborhood where residents have learned not to ask questions about the building that processes human cargo with the efficiency of a postal sorting facility. The rumors started almost as soon as the concrete dried. Whispers of upside-down crucifixion towers. Stories passed between prisoners, between guards, between the families who waited outside those walls for news that rarely came. The tales grew in the telling, as rumors do, until they took on lives of their own. But here's the thing about urban legends. They usually point toward a truth that can't be spoken directly. If the towers are myth, why does the myth keep reproducing itself? Why do the stories persist, decade after decade, in a culture that prides itself on discretion and order? Perhaps because some truths are too uncomfortable to name plainly. Perhaps because the reality of what happens behind those walls requires a kind of folklore to make it bearable to discuss. The answer lies not in medieval torture devices, but in something far more mundane and therefore more terrifying: the patient, methodical engineering of invisibility itself. Before concrete and steel, before paperwork and procedure, Japan had a different approach to punishment. The word is haretsuke, crucifixion, yes, but not the Roman kind. This was execution as public theater, bodies displayed at crossroads where travelers couldn't avoid seeing them. The message was simple and universal: transgress, and become a warning to others. The condemned were tied to wooden crosses and left for the elements to finish what the state had started. Sometimes it took days. The positioning was deliberate, not just the crossroads, but the height, the angle, the visibility from multiple directions. Death became urban planning, corpses transformed into signage. Fear was communal, shared, democratized through spectacle. But spectacle has drawbacks. It requires witnesses. It generates sympathy. It makes heroes of some victims and villains of the executioners. Most dangerous of all, it creates evidence. The kind that gets preserved in woodblock prints and historical records, the kind that future generations can judge. By the early 20th century, Japan was modernizing its approach to justice the same way it was modernizing its approach to everything else. The old ways were embarrassing, primitive, unsuited to a nation that wanted to stand among the world's civilized powers. Progress meant bringing punishment indoors, converting public agony into private procedure. The wisdom of the modern approach was its opposite logic. Instead of maximum visibility, maximum secrecy. Instead of community witnesses, institutional isolation. Instead of dramatic spectacle, bureaucratic routine. The new system wouldn't create martyrs because it wouldn't create stories. It would simply erase problems, one form at a time, one file at a time, one forgotten person at a time. This wasn't cruelty abandoning itself. This was cruelty learning to dress better. In 1908, the Japanese Diet passed the prison law. More than a century later, that law still governs how the state manages its human inventory. 116 years of accumulated precedent, interpretation, and administrative drift. 116 years of rules building on rules, procedures spawning procedures, until the original logic disappears beneath layers of institutional sediment. The law itself reads like most laws, dry, technical, concerned with classifications and jurisdictions and bureaucratic boundaries, but buried within its articles is a more interesting provision, one that reveals the true genius of modern punishment: the power to create regulations that don't require public disclosure, administrative ordinances, internal guidelines, procedural memoranda, the machinery of control hidden inside the machinery of law, like a parasite that's learned to mimic its host. The prison law doesn't just govern prisons, it governs what the public is allowed to know about prisons. Secrecy isn't a byproduct of the system. Secrecy is the system. Consider the elegant efficiency of this design. Traditional torture left evidence, scars, broken bones, witness accounts that could be verified by medical examination or testimony. But bureaucratic torture leaves only paperwork, and paperwork can be classified, restricted, lost, or simply never generated in the first place. How do you prove abuse inside a system that controls both the abuse and the proof? How do you document cruelty when the documentation process itself is controlled by the institution committing the cruelty? The prison law of 1908 didn't solve the problem of prison violence, it solved the problem of prison accountability. And that law, with all its accumulated interpretations and hidden regulations, still breathes inside the walls of every detention facility in Japan today. The geography tells its own story. Kyoto's Fushimi ward sits in the city's southern reaches, where the tourist buses don't venture and the temple maps don't extend. This isn't accidental placement. This is strategic positioning, the kind that considers traffic patterns and sightlines and noise control with the precision of military logistics. Transit corridors matter when you're moving human cargo. Railway access for prisoner transport. Highway connections for supply delivery. Residential isolation to minimize complaints about sirens and searchlights. The detention house needs to be accessible to the system while remaining invisible to the public. It needs to exist at the intersection of connection and concealment. But the most sophisticated engineering happens in the spaces between buildings. The negative architecture, what isn't built, what can't be seen, what doesn't connect to what. Sound barriers disguised as landscaping. Sightlines carefully broken by strategic placement of utility buildings and parking areas. Windows that face inward instead of outward, creating a facility that can see itself but can't be seen. The drainage systems alone tell a story of institutional paranoia. Multiple redundancies to prevent flooding, yes, but also to prevent evidence from washing into public waterways. Waste management that accounts for more than ordinary refuse. Systems designed to handle what shouldn't exist, but sometimes does anyway. Perimeter security that doesn't look like perimeter security. Walls that seem like property boundaries rather than containment barriers, lighting systems that provide visibility for guards while creating blind spots for everyone else. The entire facility designed on the principle that the most effective cage is the one that doesn't look like a cage. Even the address contributes to the invisibility. Official documents list it simply as a government facility in Fushimi. No special designations, no warning signs, no acknowledgement of its true purpose. Just another bureaucratic building in a ward full of bureaucratic buildings, processing bureaucratic problems with bureaucratic solutions. This is architecture as denial, construction as cover-up. 2.7 hectares of carefully planned amnesia, 1924. The Taisho era giving way to Showa, Japan caught between tradition and modernization, democracy and militarism. In that pivotal moment, as the country struggled to define its future, the Kyoto detention house opened its doors with no ceremony, no public announcement, no acknowledgement that the city had just acquired a new capacity for making people disappear. The timing wasn't coincidental. This was the era of administrative expansion, when the Japanese state was learning to manage society through institutions rather than edicts, through procedure rather than proclamation. The detention house represented a new philosophy of control, not the dramatic authority of the samurai, but the quiet efficiency of the civil servant. The facility's scale seemed modest compared to the massive public works projects of the era. 2.7 hectares versus the thousands of acres being converted to industrial use, the miles of railway being laid, the harbors being expanded. But scale can be deceptive. The detention house was never meant to hold vast numbers. It was meant to process individuals, one by one, with the kind of attention to detail that only comes with small batches and careful procedures. Think of it as the difference between a factory and a laboratory. Factories produce volume. Laboratories produce results. The opening of the facility marked a subtle but significant shift in how the state related to its problems. Instead of public execution creating public memory, private detention would create private erasure. Instead of warning others through spectacle, the new approach would warn others through absence. People would simply vanish from circulation, removed from the social fabric so cleanly that their disappearance would seem almost natural. The architecture reflected this philosophy. No imposing facades to intimidate passers-by. No symbols of state power to remind citizens of authority. Just a collection of functional buildings surrounded by functional walls designed to accomplish their function without drawing attention to the fact that they were functioning at all. The blueprint was complete. The machinery was in place. All that remained was to feed it the raw material it was designed to process. Human beings who had somehow run afoul of a system that preferred not to explain itself. And in 1924, in a quiet corner of an ancient city, that machinery began its work. The staff arrived each morning like any other government workers, carrying lunchboxes and newspapers, discussing weather and family obligations. But unlike other civil servants, their job description included responsibilities that couldn't be shared at dinner parties or neighborhood gatherings. They were the invisible workforce of institutional secrecy, the human components in a machine designed to process suffering with the efficiency of an assembly line. Guards, clerks, kitchen staff, maintenance workers, medical personnel, each with their own specialized knowledge, their own carefully circumscribed authority, their own reasons for not asking questions about what happened in other departments. The genius of bureaucratic cruelty lies in its division of labor. No single person needs to see the whole picture. No individual employee needs to feel responsible for the complete process. The training reinforced this fragmentary vision. Guards learned to follow procedures without questioning their purpose. Clerks learned to process paperwork without reading its contents too carefully. Kitchen staff learned to prepare meals without considering who might not be showing up to eat them. Each worker became an expert in their small corner of a larger horror they were never required to fully comprehend. Hierarchy provided additional insulation. Orders flowed downward through channels that obscured their origins. Responsibility diffused upward through layers that made accountability impossible to trace. The most dangerous decisions were made by people too far removed from their consequences to feel their weight. The most terrible consequences were implemented by people too far removed from decision-making to change them. Language became another tool of institutional protection. Euphemisms replaced direct description. Administrative segregation instead of isolation torture. Protective custody instead of punitive confinement. Compliance assistance instead of physical coercion. The vocabulary of bureaucracy transformed cruelty into policy, violence into procedure. But perhaps the most sophisticated mechanism was the cultivation of institutional amnesia. Staff learned not to remember what they'd seen, not to connect patterns across incidents, not to maintain mental records that might later become inconvenient. Memory became a professional liability. Forgetfulness became a survival skill. The paycheck helped, of course. Steady government employment during uncertain economic times. Benefits and pension contributions and job security in exchange for a kind of spiritual blindness. The institution didn't require its workers to be evil. It just required them to be financially responsible adults with families to support and bills to pay. In this way, the machinery of systematic cruelty was staffed entirely by ordinary people who went home each night to ordinary lives, who attended community festivals and school meetings and family gatherings, who maintained the fiction that their work involved nothing more troubling than filing documents and following regulations. The most effective torture chamber is the one operated by people who insist they're not torturers. Time becomes the primary restraint. Not chains, not bars, not guards with clubs. Time itself transformed into a weapon more efficient than any instrument of physical torture. 7 in the morning, the bells ring through the corridors of the Kyoto detention house. 7 in the morning, every morning, for decades of mornings, stretching back to 1924. The sound echoes through concrete and steel, through dreams and nightmares, through the thin membrane that separates sleeping from waking, in a place where both conditions offer equal misery. Rise, stand, wait for the count, hands at your sides, eyes forward, mouth closed, the human body reduced to a collection of required postures, each one specified in regulations that most inmates will never see but must somehow intuit through trial and error. Error, in this place, comes with consequences that compound like interest on a debt that can never be repaid. The schedule consumes everything. Breakfast at 7:30, work detail assignment at 8:15, morning labor from 8:30 to 11:45, lunch at 12, afternoon labor from 1 to 4:30, dinner at 5, cell lockdown at 6, lights out at 9. 8 hours of unconsciousness if you're fortunate enough to find sleep in a place designed to make sleep impossible. But it's the spaces between the scheduled events that reveal the true architecture of control. The waiting. The endless, purposeless waiting that fills the gaps between authorized activities like sand filling the cracks in broken pavement. Waiting to be counted. Waiting to be fed. Waiting to be moved from one location to another. Waiting for permission to speak, to move, to exist. The genius of the system lies in its elimination of spontaneity. Every moment accounted for, every action pre-authorized, every thought directed toward the next scheduled requirement. Free will doesn't disappear suddenly. It erodes gradually, worn away by the constant pressure of institutional routine until resistance becomes not just futile, but literally unthinkable. Prisoners learn to walk differently inside these walls. Not the confident stride of someone going somewhere important, but the shuffling half-step of someone who has learned that arriving too early is a violation, and arriving too late is a greater violation, and arriving at exactly the right time requires a kind of temporal precision that transforms human movement into mechanical function. They learn to think differently too. Planning ahead becomes dangerous because plans suggest hope, and hope suggests the possibility of change, and change is the enemy of institutional stability. Better to focus on the next meal, the next count, the next small permission that might be granted or denied based on criteria that shift without warning or explanation. The human being becomes a series of responses to institutional stimuli. Ring the bell, move to position, call the name, acknowledge with the correct phrase, issue the command, perform the required action. Pavlov understood dogs. The Japanese penal system understands people. The letters arrive on Tuesday mornings, if they arrive at all, stacked in canvas bags that smell of bureaucracy and disinfectant, sorted by guards who treat correspondence like potential contraband, which, in many ways, it is. Information is ammunition in a place where knowledge represents power, and power is reserved exclusively for those with keys. Each letter passes through multiple inspections before reaching its intended recipient. First, the preliminary screening. Guards trained to identify suspicious patterns, unusual vocabulary, references that might indicate coordination with outside accomplices or ongoing criminal enterprises. Letters written in languages other than Japanese receive additional scrutiny, translated by civil servants who may or may not understand the cultural contexts that give meaning to seemingly innocent phrases. Then comes the content analysis. Censors armed with black markers redact anything deemed inappropriate, subversive, or potentially harmful to institutional security. Expressions of anger toward guards or administrators disappear beneath thick black lines. References to prison conditions vanish into administrative darkness. Complaints about treatment become blank spaces where words used to live. But the most sophisticated censorship happens not with markers, but with delays. Letters that arrive on Tuesday might not reach inmates until the following Tuesday, or the Tuesday after that, or sometimes never at all. Time becomes the most efficient editor, transforming urgent communications into historical curiosities, rendering assistance meaningless through the simple expedient of making it arrive too late to matter. The outgoing mail receives even more attention. Prisoners learn to write in code that isn't really code, references that guards might miss but family members might understand. The building stays cold instead of, they keep us in unheated cells. I'm losing weight instead of, they're starving us. I miss the sunshine instead of, I'm being held in isolation. Language becomes archaeology, meaning buried beneath layers of acceptable phrasing. Photographs get special treatment, images from the outside world, showing family gatherings and celebrations and ordinary life continuing without them, are examined for hidden messages, for signs that might indicate escape plans or ongoing criminal activities. But mostly they're examined for the psychological impact they might have on inmates who've been carefully disconnected from anything that might remind them that another world exists beyond these walls. The cruelest censorship is the uncertainty. Inmates never know which letters will arrive and which will disappear into the administrative void. They never know whether their own letters reach their intended recipients or vanish into the same darkness. Communication becomes a lottery, where the house always wins and the players always lose. In this way, the institution doesn't just control physical movement, it controls emotional connection, intellectual stimulation, spiritual sustenance. It controls the flow of love itself, rationing human connection like a strategic resource that must be carefully managed to prevent dangerous accumulations of hope or solidarity or resistance. The pipes that carry water through the Kyoto detention house also carry something else: the memory of winter. Built in an era when heating was considered a luxury rather than a necessity, the facility's infrastructure reflects a philosophy that views comfort as incompatible with justice, warmth as contrary to the purposes of punishment. December in Kyoto brings temperatures that hover near freezing, sometimes dipping below. The ancient capital transforms into a crystalline wonderland of frost-covered temples and snow-dusted gardens. Tourists bundle in thermal layers in heated hotel rooms. But inside the detention house, winter becomes a weapon more reliable than any guard, more persistent than any regulation. The cells receive no direct heating. Concrete walls that provide excellent thermal mass during summer's heat become efficient conductors of winter's cold, drawing warmth from human bodies with the patience of geological process. Inmates wake to find their breath visible in the morning air, their bodies stiff with the accumulated chill of 8 hours spent on thin mattresses that provide no insulation from floors designed to last forever, but not to comfort anyone. Frostbite becomes a common medical complaint, though one rarely recorded in official health reports. fingers and toes that lose sensation, then color, then tissue. The body's extremities sacrifice to preserve the core, a biological triage that mirrors the institution's approach to human dignity. Preserve what's absolutely necessary for survival, sacrifice everything else. The administration refers to this as environmental conditioning, a clinical term that transforms suffering into scientific methodology. Inmates learn to sleep in shifts, huddling together for shared warmth when guards aren't looking, though physical contact between prisoners represents another violation that can trigger punishment even more severe than cold. Some learn to generate heat through constant movement, subtle exercises that can be performed in the confined space of a cell without attracting attention. Push-ups against the wall. Isometric contractions that warm muscle tissue without creating noise that might be interpreted as resistance. The human body becomes its own heating system, burning calories that are already scarce to produce warmth that is immediately lost to unheated concrete. Others learn the opposite strategy, stillness so complete that it resembles death, conservation of energy so absolute that metabolism slows to barely sustainable levels. They become human hibernation experiments, conscious beings approaching the edge of consciousness, life pared down to its most essential functions. The guards have access to heated break rooms, insulated offices, warm clothing designed for extended outdoor exposure. They move through the facility in layers that can be added or removed as comfort requires. The contrast isn't accidental, it's institutional policy made manifest in thermal engineering. Because cold is more than discomfort. Cold is exhaustion. Cold is distraction. Cold is the slow erosion of mental acuity that makes resistance not just uncomfortable, but literally unthinkable. A person focused on staying alive has little energy left for staying angry. Kyoto. The word itself sounds clinical, administrative, precisely the sort of term you might find in a training manual or policy document. Minor solitary confinement. A disciplinary measure designed to encourage compliance with institutional regulations. On paper, it appears almost gentle, not major solitary, just minor. Not indefinite isolation, just temporary adjustment. 7 in the morning until 5 in the evening. 10 hours. Not a workday, a posture assignment. Remain motionless in the position designated by guards. No reading, no writing, no conversation, no movement except as specifically authorized for biological necessities. 10 hours of enforced stillness in a space designed to make stillness torture. The cell stripped of everything that might provide distraction or comfort. No books, no paper, no personal items of any kind. The bare minimum required for survival. A toilet, a thin mattress that's removed during the day, walls that offer nothing to focus on except their own blank monotony. The human mind, designed for stimulation and engagement, forced to feed on itself for hours that stretch like years. 30 days minimum. 60 days maximum. 2 months of Kyoto means 2 months of 10-hour daily torture sessions, each one identical to the last, each one designed to break something inside the human spirit that can't be repaired once broken. Time becomes not just the punishment, but the instrument of punishment, seconds accumulating like drops of water in a Chinese water torture, until the accumulated weight becomes unbearable. The guards who oversee Kyoto develop a particular kind of professional detachment. They learn to watch for unauthorized movement with the concentration of scientists monitoring an experiment, noting violations in reports that will determine whether the punishment continues or intensifies. Eye contact with the prisoner is discouraged, not because it might humanize the process, but because it might interfere with objective observation. Medical monitoring is required by regulation, though the definition of medical emergency remains sufficiently vague to allow considerable administrative discretion. Prisoners who lose consciousness are revived and returned to position. Prisoners who develop medical complications are treated only enough to ensure they can continue serving their punishment. The body becomes a machine that must be maintained in operational condition until the prescribed torture period expires. Some prisoners emerge from Kyoto fundamentally changed, not rehabilitated in any meaningful sense, but hollowed out, their capacity for resistance permanently damaged. They become model inmates not because they've learned respect for authority, but because they've learned that resistance produces consequences worse than compliance. Others emerge with something broken that never heals, a kind of psychological damage that expresses itself in unpredictable ways. Sudden violence, followed by complete shutdown, catatonic episodes that alternate with periods of hyperaggressive behavior. The system labels these as pre-existing mental health conditions rather than acknowledging what they actually represent: the predictable consequences of deliberately inflicted psychological trauma. The most troubling cases are those who emerge from Kyoto claiming to feel grateful. Grateful for regular meals after months of restricted diet. Grateful for human contact after months of isolation. Grateful for the privilege of returning to a regular cell after months of solitary confinement. These are not signs of successful rehabilitation. These are signs of successful psychological conditioning, the human spirit trained to find comfort in conditions that would have been unbearable before the training began. Kyoto doesn't correct behavior. It corrects people, transforming them into something more manageable, more predictable, more suitable for long-term institutional storage. The protection cells occupy a section of the facility that doesn't appear on public maps, accessible through corridors that branch off from the main circulation pattern like capillaries feeding essential organs. These are the rooms reserved for special circumstances, situations that require enhanced management techniques, problems that can't be solved through standard disciplinary measures. No windows. The artificial lighting operates on cycles controlled by guards rather than by the passage of day and night outside. Fluorescent tubes that hum constantly with electrical current, casting a sickly pallor over everything they illuminate. The light itself becomes another form of control, too bright to allow restful sleep, too dim to permit comfortable reading, constant enough to eliminate the natural rhythms that help human beings maintain psychological stability. The furnishings are minimal and designed for safety rather than comfort. Safety in this context means preventing suicide attempts rather than preventing suffering. Suicide represents an institutional failure, a loss of inventory that must be explained to supervisors, documented in reports, investigated by committees that ask uncomfortable questions about procedures and policies. Restraints are available in multiple configurations depending on the level of control required. Soft restraints for long-term immobilization, hard restraints for acute situations, chemical restraints for cases where physical restraints prove insufficient. Each option represents a different approach to the same fundamental challenge: how to maintain absolute control over a human being who has stopped cooperating with their own imprisonment. The surveillance in protection cells operates continuously, cameras that record everything for later review by administrators who treat human degradation as training material. Guards learn to identify the early signs of psychological breakdown, not to prevent it, but to manage it efficiently. The goal isn't to maintain mental health. The goal is to maintain institutional order. While mental health disintegrates in controlled, documentable ways, meals arrive through slots that eliminate human contact during the most vulnerable moments of the day. Food becomes another tool of control. Its temperature, its quantity, its timing all carefully managed to reinforce dependency and submission. Prisoners learn to be grateful for food that would be considered inadequate in any other context, thankful for treatment that would be considered abusive in any other setting. Medical access is provided according to strict protocols that prioritize institutional security over patient welfare. Doctors and nurses who treat protection cell inmates learn to document injuries and illnesses in ways that obscure their institutional origins. Broken bones become falls during routine movement. Malnutrition becomes failure to eat provided meals. Psychological trauma becomes pre-existing mental health conditions. The most sophisticated cruelty happens in the spaces between official procedures. Guards who understand exactly how much force they can apply without creating documentation requirements. Medical staff who understand exactly how much treatment they can withhold without triggering investigation. Administrators who understand exactly how much human destruction they can cause without violating the technical letter of regulations they wrote themselves. But perhaps the most effective protection provided by these cells is protection for the institution itself. Protection from witnesses, protection from documentation, protection from the kind of evidence that might someday be used to hold someone accountable for what happens here in the darkness between official reports. The stories spread through the cell blocks like fever, whispered between inmates during brief moments when guards can't overhear, passed along through the elaborate communication networks that develop in places where communication is forbidden, tales of torture chambers hidden beneath the main facility, underground passages connecting to medieval execution sites, rooms equipped with devices that wouldn't have seemed out of place in the Spanish Inquisition, upside-down crucifixion towers. The image lodges in the imagination and refuses to leave. Bodies suspended head downward until blood pools in the skull, and consciousness becomes a kind of drowning in your own life force. It's vivid, terrible, specific enough to feel believable, but extreme enough to feel like something from another century, another country, another moral universe entirely. The guards hear the stories too, and some of them smile when they think no one is watching, not because the stories are true, but because they serve a purpose more valuable than truth. Fear is an excellent management tool, and fear of the unknown is more effective than fear of the known. Let the inmates imagine chambers that might or might not exist, punishments that might or might not be waiting for them if they step too far out of line. The administration neither confirms nor denies the rumors. Official policy maintains that all disciplinary procedures comply with applicable laws and regulations, that treatment of inmates meets international standards for humane detention, that allegations of abuse are investigated thoroughly and remediated appropriately. But official policy also recognizes that a certain level of inmate anxiety contributes to institutional security and order. Folklore becomes an institutional asset. Stories that keep prisoners awake at night wondering what might happen if they're caught planning an escape, filing a complaint, contacting a journalist, challenging the authority of guards who might have access to punishment methods that aren't described in any manual or regulation. Imagination fills the spaces left by secrecy, and imagination tends toward worst-case scenarios when fed by the day-to-day reality of institutionalized cruelty. But the most interesting thing about the upside-down crucifixion tower stories is how they distract from the documented realities of life inside the Kyoto detention house. While inmates whisper about mythical torture devices, they're actually experiencing the slow torture of sleep deprivation, malnutrition, social isolation, psychological manipulation, and administrative sadism that requires no special equipment and violates no specific regulations. The reality is more terrifying than the mythology, because the reality is legal, systematic, officially sanctioned, and therefore infinitely repeatable. You can't prosecute someone for operating an imaginary torture tower, but you also can't prosecute someone for operating a legal detention facility that happens to destroy human beings through the careful application of bureaucratic procedure. The myth protects the machine by making it seem more dramatic than it actually is. People can dismiss stories about crucifixion towers as obviously false, which makes it easier to dismiss stories about unheated cells and punishment postures and protection cells that actually do exist and actually are destroying people every day. Sometimes the most effective cover story is the one that makes the truth sound boring by comparison. The letter arrives on a Tuesday morning in March, carried in the same canvas bag that delivers family photographs and birthday wishes and news from a world that feels increasingly like something glimpsed through the wrong end of a telescope. But this letter is different. This letter has an official stamp, a case number, a reference to regulations that most guards have never read, but all guards have learned to respect. Inmate 4-847 has filed a formal complaint alleging mistreatment by staff members. Specific allegations include denial of medical care, provision of inadequate food, maintenance of unsanitary conditions, and application of disciplinary measures in violation of established protocols. The complaint requests investigation by appropriate authorities and implementation of corrective measures to ensure compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The paperwork moves through channels like blood through arteries, each office adding its own stamp, its own notation, its own delay. The warden's office reviews the allegations for accuracy and completeness. The administrative office reviews them for proper formatting and procedural compliance. The legal office reviews them for potential liability and public relations implications. But the most important review happens in the margins of the official process, in conversations that don't get recorded between people whose names don't appear on organizational charts. The word spreads through the institutional grapevine that someone has broken the unwritten rule that governs survival in places like this. Don't make trouble for people who control your access to food, medical care, and the thousand small mercies that make existence bearable. Inmate 4, 847, doesn't know it yet, but he's just transformed himself from a management problem into a management priority. His complaint will receive all the attention it deserves under applicable regulations. All the attention, and perhaps a little more. The investigation begins within 72 hours, as required by policy. Guards who were present during the alleged incidents are interviewed by supervisors who understand that institutional solidarity matters more than strict adherence to facts. Witnesses are identified and questioned, though the definition of credible witness excludes inmates whose testimony might contradict staff accounts of disputed events. Medical records are reviewed for evidence of the alleged denial of care, though the records themselves were written by the medical staff being investigated, using diagnostic criteria that allow considerable discretion in determining what constitutes adequate treatment. Food service logs are examined for evidence of nutritional deficiency, though the logs were compiled by the same food service staff whose procedures are being questioned. The beauty of the system reveals itself in its circularity. Evidence is gathered by the people who would be responsible if evidence of wrongdoing were found. Testimony is evaluated by supervisors whose own competence would be questioned if their subordinates were found to have violated regulations. Credibility is assessed by administrators whose careers depend on maintaining institutional reputation. Meanwhile, Inmate 4, 847, begins to notice small changes in his daily routine. His work assignment changes to a detail that requires longer hours and more physical labor. His cell is selected for more frequent searches, conducted with the kind of thoroughness that transforms personal belongings into scattered debris. His mail begins arriving later, when it arrives at all, subjected to additional screening procedures that seem to discover an unusual number of regulatory violations. The guards who interact with him develop a particular way of looking through him rather than at him, as if he's become transparent, less substantial than before. Requests that might have received routine approval now require additional review. Medical complaints that might have been treated with over-the-counter medications now require specialist consultations that somehow never get scheduled. None of these changes violate any specific regulation. Each one can be explained as normal institutional procedure, justified by security concerns or administrative necessity or resource limitations. But together they create a climate of pressure that teaches an important lesson about the relationship between official rights and practical reality. The investigation concludes 6 weeks later with a finding that while certain procedural improvements might enhance institutional operations, no evidence was found to substantiate allegations of systematic mistreatment or violation of applicable regulations. The complainant is informed of these findings through official channels and advised that further allegations of a similar nature will be subject to additional scrutiny for accuracy and motivation. Inmate 4, 847, learns what every institutional veteran already knows. The system always wins because the system gets to define winning. His complaint has been processed according to regulation, investigated according to protocol, and resolved according to procedure. Justice has been served, at least in the sense that justice is defined by the people who control the definition. The real punishment isn't the official finding. It's everything that happens afterward. The subtle but persistent pressure that transforms daily existence from mere suffering into something approaching spiritual annihilation. The machine doesn't just process complaints, it processes complainants, reducing them to a psychological state where future complaints become literally unthinkable. The message spreads through the cell blocks without being spoken. Resistance is not futile, it's worse than futile. It's counterproductive, a guaranteed method for transforming bearable misery into unbearable torment. The system doesn't need to prevent complaints, it just needs to demonstrate that complaining makes everything worse. In this way, the machinery of accountability becomes another component in the machinery of control, another tool for maintaining order through fear rather than justice through transparency. The complaint process exists not to protect inmates from abuse, but to protect the institution from effective resistance to abuse. And somewhere in the filing cabinets of the administrative office, the complaint filed by inmate 4-847 joins thousands of other documents that together tell a story no one is authorized to read, evidence of a pattern no one is permitted to recognize, proof of systematic problems that can only be addressed by people whose careers depend on proving that no systematic problems exist. The warnings arrive through unofficial channels, passed along through the complex social networks that develop whenever human beings are forced to survive together under impossible conditions. Guard to guard, shift to shift, department to department. The word spreads like smoke through ventilation systems. Tighten up, watch your backs. Someone upstairs is asking questions. The questions themselves remain vague, undefined, the sort of administrative inquiry that could mean anything or nothing, depending on what the investigation reveals. But vagueness is its own form of communication in institutional settings, where careers can be destroyed by association with problems that haven't even been formally identified yet. Staff meetings become exercises in collective amnesia. Supervisors remind subordinates about proper procedures without specifying which procedures might have been violated. Training sessions review appropriate use of force without mentioning any incidents where force might have been used inappropriately. Policy updates clarify regulatory requirements without acknowledging that previous compliance might have been inadequate. But the most effective communication happens in the spaces between official announcements. Guards who work the night shift during certain weeks find themselves transferred to different details. Civilian employees who had access to particular areas of the facility discover that their access has been quietly modified. Medical staff who treated specific inmates notice that their patient assignments have been redistributed for administrative reasons that are never fully explained. The institution develops institutional Alzheimer's, a selective forgetting that affects everyone simultaneously. Security logs that might have contained relevant information are archived ahead of schedule. Maintenance records that might have documented environmental problems are transferred to off-site storage for space management purposes. Personnel files that might have revealed patterns of behavior are restricted under privacy policies that suddenly become more strictly enforced. Individual staff members learn to practice personal amnesia as well. Guards who might have witnessed questionable incidents discover that their memories have become surprisingly unreliable. Supervisors who might have been aware of problematic policies find that their recollections lack the specificity required for formal testimony. Administrators who might have authorized controversial procedures realize that their understanding of past events has become frustratingly imprecise. The beauty of institutional memory loss is its collective nature. When everyone forgets together, forgetting becomes indistinguishable from truth. When no one remembers what actually happened becomes whatever can be proven through documentation that may or may not still exist, testimony from witnesses who may or may not still remember, evidence that may or may not have been properly preserved. Meanwhile, the daily operations of the facility continue unchanged. Inmates still wake at the same time, eat the same food, follow the same routines, submit to the same controls. The machine keeps running even while its operators practice collective forgetting about how the machine actually works, what it actually does, what actually happens to the human beings fed into its mechanical processes. Retaliation becomes indistinguishable from routine because routine itself becomes a form of retaliation. Every regulation strictly enforced. Every procedure followed to the letter. Every privilege subject to review. Every accommodation requiring additional justification, every request demanding additional documentation that somehow always reveals additional reasons for denial. The institutional directive is never written down because it doesn't need to be. Everyone understands the new parameters without being told. Zero tolerance for problems that might attract attention. Absolute compliance with procedures that might be scrutinized. Maximum efficiency in processing problems that might otherwise require explanation. And in the cell blocks, the inmates notice the change, even if they can't quite identify what's different. Guards who were merely indifferent become actively hostile. Staff members who occasionally showed mercy become uniformly rigid. The small accommodations that made life barely tolerable disappear one by one, replaced by strict adherence to regulations that leave no room for human consideration. The machine is tightening, adjusting its pressure settings, calibrating its instruments for maximum effectiveness. Someone has complained, and now everyone will learn the cost of complaining through the simple expedient of experiencing what happens when an institution dedicated to control decides to demonstrate the full extent of its capabilities. The budget arrives in manila folders thick with spreadsheets and projections, cost-benefit analyses that reduce human suffering to line items and administrative efficiency to metrics that can be tracked quarter by quarter. The numbers tell their own story, though it's a story that requires careful reading to understand what's being measured and what's being ignored. Heating costs, deferred maintenance on boiler systems, energy efficiency, improvements postponed due to budget constraints, thermal comfort standards adjusted to reflect fiscal realities rather than human needs. The euphemisms multiply like bureaucratic cancer, transforming deliberate cruelty into sound fiscal management, systematic neglect into responsible resource allocation, staffing ratios, optimized for cost-effectiveness rather than security or humane treatment. Fewer guards per shift means longer response times to emergencies, less supervision during vulnerable periods, more opportunities for problems that don't get documented because there's no one available to document them. But the budget reflects only salary savings, not the hidden costs of understaffing that show up in medical reports and incident statistics that are filed separately and rarely cross-referenced. Medical services, contracted to private providers who bid for the work by promising to deliver adequate care at reduced costs. Adequate becomes a term of art, defined not by medical standards but by contractual obligations that specify minimum requirements, rather than optimal outcomes. Prisoners receive medical attention that meets the letter of regulations while violating the spirit of everything those regulations were intended to accomplish. Food service, nutritional standards met through precise calculation of minimum caloric requirements. Vitamin content optimized for cost rather than palatability or satisfaction. Meals that technically provide adequate nutrition while delivering maximum psychological punishment through their monotony, their temperature, their presentation, their timing. The budget process transforms policy decisions into mathematical exercises, moral choices into actuarial calculations. How much does it cost to heat a cell block? How much does the institution save by keeping cells unheated? What's the break-even point between maintaining human dignity and maximizing operational efficiency? Maintenance schedules are adjusted to reflect financial priorities rather than safety concerns. Repairs that might improve living conditions are deferred in favor of repairs that might affect institutional security. Broken heating systems wait for replacement, while broken locks receive immediate attention. Malfunctioning ventilation that makes cells barely habitable gets less priority than malfunctioning surveillance that makes cells less observable. Equipment purchases reveal institutional priorities with brutal clarity. New restraint devices receive funding while replacement mattresses do not. Enhanced security monitoring systems get approved while medical equipment requests get denied. Technology that helps control inmates receives investment, while technology that might help inmates receives scrutiny. The capital improvement budget tells the real story of institutional intentions. Money available for construction projects that enhance security, expand capacity, improve efficiency. No money available for projects that might improve habitability, reduce suffering, or acknowledge that the people being processed here are actually people rather than inventory. But perhaps the most revealing line item is the one that doesn't appear anywhere in the budget documents. The cost of accountability, the expense of transparency, the price of treating systematic problems as problems rather than as features of a system working exactly as intended. Because some costs are considered too expensive to calculate, some expenses too dangerous to acknowledge, some prices too high to pay, even when the alternative is the gradual destruction of human beings, one budget cycle at a time. The machinery of fiscal responsibility becomes indistinguishable from the machinery of systematic cruelty, both operating according to the same principle: optimize for measurable outcomes while ignoring immeasurable consequences. The budget balances. The institution operates efficiently. The human cost disappears into categories that don't require explanation, line items that don't demand justification, savings that don't account for what's actually being saved or what's actually being lost. The call comes at 3:17 in the morning, the kind of call that transforms institutional routine into institutional crisis in the space of a single sentence. Inmate 2, 451, has been found unresponsive in his cell during routine night check. Medical personnel have been summoned. The warden has been notified. The machinery of official response begins to turn with the precision that only comes from extensive practice at managing situations that aren't supposed to happen, but somehow keep happening anyway. The medical team arrives within minutes, following protocols that have been refined through repetition into something approaching choreography. Vital signs are checked and recorded. Resuscitation attempts are made and documented. Time of death is noted with clinical precision: 3:34 a.m. Hours, March 15th. Cause of death: pending autopsy results, contributing factors, under investigation. But the real emergency response happens in the administrative offices, where staff members who were home in their beds 20 minutes ago are now gathered around conference tables covered with policy manuals and incident report forms. The crisis isn't medical. The medical crisis ended at 3:34. The crisis is bureaucratic: how to manage information, control narrative, minimize liability. The warden arrives dressed in the kind of carefully pressed uniform that suggests he keeps emergency clothing at the office for situations exactly like this one. His first question isn't about what happened to inmate 2, 451. His first question is about who else knows what happened, what they know, and how long the institution has before that knowledge spreads beyond the perimeter of official control. Security footage is reviewed by personnel who understand that what they're looking for isn't evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of compliance with established procedures. The cameras show guards conducting routine checks at prescribed intervals. They show no obvious signs of disturbance or violence. They show institutional routine continuing normally until the discovery of the body during scheduled rounds. What the cameras don't show is often more interesting than what they do show, but institutional policy focuses on documented evidence rather than evidentiary gaps. The timeline is reconstructed based on available information rather than missing information. The official narrative begins to form before the unofficial investigation even begins. Medical records are pulled and reviewed for any indication of pre-existing conditions that might explain sudden death in a young, otherwise healthy individual. Previous complaints about medical treatment are noted and contextualized as evidence of ongoing care rather than inadequate care. Mental health evaluations are examined for signs of depression or suicidal ideation that might support a finding of self-inflicted death. The cell itself is processed like a crime scene, though the processing focuses on eliminating evidence of institutional responsibility rather than discovering evidence of institutional failure. Photographs are taken from angles that emphasize the adequacy of space, lighting, and basic amenities. Physical evidence is collected and cataloged with attention to anything that might support the emerging official narrative. But the most important work happens in the conversation between what gets documented and what doesn't get documented, what gets investigated and what gets overlooked, what gets explained and what gets left unexplained. The institution has extensive experience with deaths in custody, and that experience has taught valuable lessons about information management, evidence control, and narrative construction. The guards who were on duty during the relevant period are interviewed separately, their statements taken by supervisors who understand the difference between what actually happened and what can be proven to have happened. Memories become remarkably consistent when shaped by institutional pressure and professional self-interest. Timelines align. Observations converge. Contradictions resolve themselves through the natural process of collective recollection. The autopsy will be performed by a medical examiner who contracts regularly with the correctional system, someone who understands the difference between medical conclusions and administrative necessities. Cause of death will be determined based on physical evidence interpreted through professional judgment that takes into account the practical realities of institutional medicine and the legal requirements of official findings. Meanwhile, inmate 2, 451's personal effects are inventoried and prepared for return to family members who will be notified through official channels about the death of their son, brother, father. The notification will express appropriate sympathy while avoiding any language that might suggest institutional responsibility or inadequate care. Death will be presented as a tragedy that occurred within the facility rather than because of the facility. The cell is cleaned and prepared for its next occupant. Any evidence that inmate 2, 451 ever existed there is removed or painted over or replaced. The institutional memory of his presence is erased through the simple expedient of returning his living space to the generic condition it maintained before his arrival and will maintain long after his departure. By 6 a.m., the facility has returned to normal operations. Breakfast is served at the usual time. Work details report to their assigned locations. Guards change shifts according to established schedules. The machinery of daily routine continues without interruption, as if nothing had happened, as if no one had died, as if the death of a human being were no more disruptive to institutional function than a burned-out light bulb or a clogged drain. The incident report will be filed within 24 hours, as required by regulation. The family will be notified within 48 hours, as required by procedure. The investigation will be completed within 30 days, as required by policy. All requirements will be met, all procedures followed, all regulations satisfied. But the most important achievement is the one that doesn't appear in any report: the successful transformation of a potential institutional failure into a routine administrative event, managed according to established protocols, resolved according to existing procedures, forgotten according to institutional necessity. The machinery of death has become indistinguishable from the machinery of accountability, both operating according to the same fundamental principle. Protect the institution first, address the problem second, acknowledge responsibility never. The prison exists within a criminal justice system that has its own relationship with death, its own procedures for ending human life under circumstances deemed appropriate by law and public policy. 3 prefectures away, Tokyo operates execution facilities that represent the culmination of Japan's approach to ultimate punishment. Death delivered through institutional process rather than public spectacle. Termination achieved through bureaucratic efficiency rather than dramatic ceremony. The execution chamber itself reflects the same philosophical approach that governs the detention system. Clean, clinical, designed for operational efficiency rather than symbolic impact, the condemned person is led through corridors that could belong to any government building into a room that could serve any administrative function to meet death that arrives without fanfare or announcement. But the most revealing aspect of Japanese execution protocol is its approach to responsibility. 3 buttons, 3 guards, 3 simultaneous actions. Only one button actually triggers the mechanism that opens the trap door, but all 3 guards press their buttons at exactly the same moment, ensuring that no individual can ever know with certainty whether they personally caused the death or merely participated in a procedure that someone else actually completed. This distribution of responsibility serves multiple purposes. It reduces the psychological burden on individual staff members by making personal responsibility impossible to establish. It protects the institution from the kind of moral injury that might result from requiring specific individuals to directly cause death. Most importantly, it transforms execution from a personal act into an institutional process, death by committee rather than death by individual decision. The genius of the three-button system lies in its elimination of individual agency while maintaining collective responsibility. Everyone participates, no one decides. Everyone contributes, no one controls. The human element is preserved while human accountability is eliminated, creating a machine that can kill people without requiring anyone to acknowledge that they've killed people. This same philosophy governs operations at every level of the correctional system. Institutional cruelty distributed across enough individuals that no single person needs to feel responsible for the complete picture. Administrative violence delegated through enough bureaucratic layers that accountability becomes impossible to trace. Systematic abuse divided into enough specialized functions that everyone can focus on their small piece without confronting the larger horror they're collectively creating. The detention house staff who deny medical care are following procurement procedures. The guards who maintain unheated cells are implementing energy conservation measures. The administrators who design punishment protocols are ensuring institutional security and regulatory compliance. Everyone has their specialized function, their professional justification, their regulatory authority. But unlike the execution chamber, where the outcome is acknowledged even if responsibility is diffused, the detention system operates through a more sophisticated form of moral camouflage. The slow death that results from systematic abuse never gets officially recognized as death, never gets processed as institutional outcome, never gets acknowledged as intended consequence. Instead, it gets classified as natural death, medical failure, pre-existing condition, personal choice. The institution processes people to death while maintaining official records that show only routine medical events, individual psychological problems, unfortunate coincidences that require no systematic response or institutional modification. The three-button execution system represents honest acknowledgement of institutional killing. The detention system represents something far more sophisticated, institutional killing that never admits to being institutional killing, death by procedure that maintains plausible deniability, murder by policy that disguises itself as natural consequence. And in this way, the machinery of execution and the machinery of detention reveal themselves as different expressions of the same underlying principle: the state's power to end human life while protecting itself from moral accountability for ending human life, death delivered through institutional process that distributes responsibility so thoroughly that responsibility essentially ceases to exist. The press release arrives on letterhead that carries the seal of the Ministry of Justice, formatted according to official standards for public communication, reviewed by multiple departments for accuracy and appropriate tone. The announcement concerns administrative changes designed to enhance operational efficiency and ensure continued compliance with applicable regulations and international standards for correctional management. Effective immediately, the Kyoto Detention House will implement enhanced monitoring procedures for medical care delivery, updated protocols for environmental management, and revised training programs for staff development. These improvements reflect ongoing commitment to institutional excellence and responsive adaptation to evolving best practices in contemporary corrections administration. The language is carefully calibrated to suggest reform without acknowledging problems, improvement without admitting inadequacy, progress without implying previous failures. Every word has been selected for its capacity to convey action while avoiding liability, responsibility without accountability, change without admission that change was necessary. Meanwhile, investigative journalists who have been tracking patterns of deaths in custody, allegations of systematic abuse, and institutional resistance to transparency find themselves encountering new forms of bureaucratic resistance. Documents that were previously available through public records requests are now classified under expanded interpretations of security regulations. Staff members who might have provided unofficial information now cite revised employment policies that impose severe penalties for unauthorized communication with media. Human rights organizations that have documented conditions inside Japanese detention facilities discover that their access to inmates and information has become significantly more restricted. Site visits that were once routine now require extensive advance coordination, and are subject to conditions that limit observation to approved areas during approved times with approved personnel present to ensure compliance with institutional security requirements. But the most effective response to public scrutiny is the one that doesn't look like a response at all. The gradual expansion of the very policies and procedures that created the problems in the first place, implemented under the banner of reform and improvement. More surveillance, presented as enhanced monitoring. More isolation, described as improved security. More control, justified as better management. The institutional defense mechanism reveals itself not through denial or resistance, but through incorporation. Criticism gets absorbed into policy development. Opposition gets integrated into planning processes. Resistance gets transformed into consultation opportunities that allow the institution to demonstrate its responsiveness while ensuring that actual operations remain fundamentally unchanged. Staff members who might have been sources for journalists or advocates find themselves reassigned to positions where they have less access to sensitive information or controversial operations. Procedures that might have provided evidence of systematic problems are modified not to eliminate the problems, but to eliminate the evidence, creating new forms of documentation that obscure rather than reveal institutional practices. The most sophisticated element of the institutional response is its proactive nature. Rather than waiting for specific allegations to emerge, the administration begins addressing potential criticisms before they're raised, implementing cosmetic changes that can be cited as evidence of institutional responsiveness while preserving the essential elements of systematic abuse. Training programs get updated to include sessions on proper documentation techniques, appropriate use of force protocols, and legal compliance requirements. But the actual training focuses on how to document abuse in ways that comply with regulatory language, rather than how to eliminate abuse, how to justify violence rather than how to prevent it, how to manage evidence rather than how to prevent the creation of evidence. Medical staff receive enhanced training on diagnostic procedures that allow institutional injuries to be classified as pre-existing conditions, environmental damage to be attributed to individual health problems, psychological trauma to be diagnosed as personality disorders that preceded incarceration rather than resulted from incarceration. The budget reflects increased allocation for staff development, enhanced monitoring systems, and improved compliance procedures. But the actual expenditures go toward more sophisticated methods of control, more efficient systems of abuse, more effective techniques for avoiding accountability while maintaining operational effectiveness. In this way, public pressure for reform becomes fuel for institutional enhancement. Criticism becomes raw material for improved operations. Resistance becomes opportunity for demonstrating adaptability and responsiveness. The machine doesn't just survive scrutiny. It uses scrutiny to make itself stronger, more efficient, more resistant to future criticism. And somewhere in the administrative files of the Ministry of Justice, a new policy directive is being drafted that will expand the successful innovations developed at Kyoto to other detention facilities throughout the system, spreading the lessons learned from managing institutional crisis to institutions that haven't yet experienced their own crises, but certainly will if they're patient enough and efficient enough and careful enough in their documentation procedures. The machinery of systematic abuse has learned to present itself as the machinery of systematic reform, evolution disguised as revolution, intensification masqueraded as improvement. The institution survives by promising to change while ensuring that the only changes implemented are changes that make survival more certain, resistance more difficult, accountability more remote.